have a confession to make to start this conversation. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up reading Superman's comics, I always found the story of Lex Luthor more interesting, right? So the bad guy in the story. I find it more rich, more complex, a different story to tell, and he had more hurdles to overcome. So the challenge of innovation for Lex Luthor, who had nothing but his intelligence when confronting Superman, was something that fascinated me. I know that I'm not alone in this fascination by the bad guy of the story. Just last week, Darth Vader was voted as the most popular character in Star Wars, right? So there's certainly something there about us trying to empathize and understand the challenges of adversarial forces. Now, I'm so fascinated by this topic that I ended up making it one very important part of my professional career. I study criminal innovation. I study how criminal actors, actors that are labeled as outside of the system, that commit crimes, sometimes very heinous crimes, are able to survive in that environment and sometimes even thrive. In particular, I am fascinated by mafias and drug cartels, smuggling organizations. I study in particular the ones from Mexico. How is it possible that even after billions of dollars are thrown at them to kill them, to arrest them, they are able to continue their work and they can keep a very profitable business model active? So because of this topic, in places like this, when the Q&A comes, somebody will ask me, well, what do you think about the war on drugs? Do you think that we should legalize the drugs, or do you think that we should maintain the drug prohibition? And this is a question that has always bugged me. It bothers me, and I didn't know why. And I decided that when I got the invitation to speak here with you, I decided that I wanted to explore why this question bothers me. And I think now that I know why, I've been thinking a lot about it. I think it's a false dilemma. I think we're being presented with a false question. And here is why. We're being presented with something that sounds like a black and white kind of question, right? Either you are in favor of legalization of drugs, or you are against the legalization of drugs. Right? Like if those would be the two options. And I think they are not. I think that there are more options there. But if there are other options, what are those options? The argument goes something like this, and you've heard it before, I am sure. Sure, you legalize marijuana, but then what's next? Crack cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, sniffing glue, right? Where do you draw the line? That would be a question that will be asked. Is this proverbial line that suddenly appears? Where do you draw the line? What line do you draw in order to decide if you legalize drugs or not? And this seems to be an argument that cannot be confronted. Now, we know today, and I'll start by marijuana because that's where the argument starts. Sure, you legalize marijuana, but then what? We know today that there are three main uses for marijuana. We have a medical marijuana, a recreational marijuana, and we have two uses, and this creates a legal framework for the drug. Now, marijuana is very interesting as a drug for two reasons. The first one is a very rapid trend towards decriminalization or legalization all over the planet and within the United States of America. Now, the US is important because a lot of the regulations that we have on the war on drugs come from regulatory environments from the United States that later were exported all over the world. So whatever happens in the United States has very powerful trickle effects all over the planet. As a police officer in Mexico told me, right? Here we are fighting a war against the drug cartels when people in Colorado and Washington State now can buy marijuana legally. Right? So it's very difficult for the world regime against drugs to sustain its policies if the United States changes. Right? So, but even though marijuana, it's been legalized at the state level and state and local level in many states in the United States, it still remains a Schedule I drug within the country at the federal level. Right? The United States has a federal government, so at the federal level, the cannabis remains a Schedule I drug. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that it's the worst kind of drugs. That's what it means. When you hear Schedule I, there are many schedules. Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, Schedule 1 is the worst one. It's really the worst kind of offenders. You are high up there with the worst kind of drugs that are available. To put it in perspective, cocaine is Schedule 2, right? So this says that marijuana is a worse drug than cocaine, right? And alcohol and tobacco are not there, right? So you're starting to understand where I'm going with this. So in theory, if you see the federal law, you would claim, right, that there is a formula, that there is an equation that gives you the schedules. It says Schedule X equals, and 3 variables. Variable 1, the potential for abuse. How much can I abuse this drug? Variable 2, accepted medical use. Variable 3, physical and physiological dependence. In theory, if a drug has a high potential for abuse, a high physical and physiological dependence, and no accepted medical use, then it's a Schedule 1. But wait a minute, right? We know that marijuana has medical uses. We know it because we have a really big amount of peer-reviewed research now that has both anecdotal and double-blind controlled trial, randomized controlled trials that have demonstrated some medical uses of marijuana, right? But we also know it because the Surgeon General of the United States, so the highest medical authority of the country, has publicly acknowledged that marijuana has certain medical properties. If it has certain medical properties, in theory, it shouldn't be Schedule 1 because the criteria number 2, accepted medical use, it's not met. Nevertheless, it's still Schedule 1. So what I want to tell you here is that this is not true, that the current formula that we have is not based on science, is not evidence-based politics and policy. What we have today is a political determination in which certain drugs, like marijuana or ecstasy, which is proven as a relatively safe drug, are placed in very high schedules, and some others that are more politically accepted are not. Again, like alcohol and tobacco. Because if you go back to this formula, tobacco has a high potential for abuse. It has no accepted medical use or very limited one, and it has a high physiological dependence, and nevertheless is not on the schedule. So the first claim that I want to discuss with you is that whatever the decision we have, whatever thing we do with drugs, we should be pushing forward to have an evidence-based determination of the level of risk associated to any drug, right? So that's the first claim that we should be working for. Now I want to go back to that formula, to those 3 variables. Because even if we accept that we would have an evidence-based policy, we have 3 variables there that are very different. And I want to discuss them with you because this is what gave us the war on drugs. This is the underpinnings, the scaffolding, the foundation of the war on drugs. We have 3 variables there. So variable 1 is potential for abuse, right? If a drug can be abused very easily or not. The variable 3 is physical and physiological dependence. How much will I be dependent on this drug if I keep using it? Those 2 variables are what you would call risk mitigation variables. Those are side effects of a product. And you want to decrease the level of side effects, of negative effects that you get with the drug. Now, the interesting thing is that the variable number 2 in the middle is accepted medical use. That's not a risk mitigation claim or objective. That's an objective of determination. You're saying what the drug should be used for, medical use, right? So to put it in perspective, think of aviation, think of planes. If we would be at the beginning of the 20th century inventing planes, right? Variable 1 and variable 3 are risk mitigation variables. We want to make planes safer, right? So let's find a way so we don't kill ourselves while using it. Variable 2, it's actually different. It's like if we would say, well, and planes can only be used to deliver mail, right? To deliver the postal service, which was one of the first uses of planes, right? So you're saying for what it should be used. So the other 2 variables gave us how to use it safely, but this one tells us how to use it, period, right? Only for medical purposes. We come to a very interesting first conclusion, right? Because the criminal drug market that we have today, it's not based on medical use. Granted, there are some places in the world where medical pharmacology is smuggled, specifically in the developing countries where it's hard to find retrovirals for AIDS or chemotherapy is too expensive, then criminal markets would fulfill that market. But in general, most of the black market for drugs, it's based on not medical use. It's based in many things, but specifically in two that I want to discuss today. The first is a human desire, right? The human desire of cognitive recreation. What's that? Well, I saw the faces of some of you. It's Saturday, so you probably went partying yesterday, right? If you went partying yesterday and you took a glass of wine, right, or a martini straight up, you were using a drug for cognitive recreation. Yeah, you were changing your mental state of mind through a legal drug in order to have fun. Well, statistically speaking, look at the person next to you. That person probably has smoked weed in his life, right? Because now more than 50% of millennials have. So, and you do it mostly for cognitive recreation, right? To have a certain kind of sensorial experience associated to the consumption of the drug. It can be a social event or a personal event. There are many reasons, right? Now, science and technology has been giving us cognitive recreation for many years. Here you have a few numbers, right? So the first one is recreational computation. We have another name for that. We call them video games, right? And video games, so having fun with computer science, it's a $100 billion industry, right? We have recreational cinematography, having fun with the cinematographer that the Frères Lumière invented. Well, we call it the movies, right? That's $88 billion. And yes, by the way, video games are now a bigger industry than the movies. So Mario Bros. Has won, right? Then you have recreational travel, right? Going to places. That was not being tourist. It's a $1 trillion industry that uses elements like aviation or construction of big buildings, etc., that has given us a $1 trillion economy. Well, here you have recreational pharmacology, right? Recreational pharmacology, having fun with pharma, right? It's depending who you believe, it's a $300 to $750 billion industry, right? It's a big industry, bigger than video games or bigger than the movie theater, in part because of its illegality. Because whereas the first three industries that I showed you were legal industries, the fourth one is not. It is illegal to do anything, with exception of alcohol and tobacco, to have fun with pharma. Right? The second big use for drugs in the clandestine market, the second human desire, is human enhancement. What's human enhancement? Well, let me put it this way, right? When we asked Lance Armstrong if he could have won the Tour de France without doping, he said, no way, impossible. Right? Why? Because everybody's doping, right? So if you're a non-enhanced human being trying to defeat a bunch of enhanced people through the use of steroids and many other drugs, you are in a very strong disadvantage, right? Sports communities from FIFA to the Olympic committees of the world have been fighting this war against doping for many years. And you might not want to inject your eyeballs with a dark liquid in order to have night vision. But some people do want to do it, right? And biohackers are playing with the limits of what it means to be human through pharmacology, right? This actually happened recently. Now, interestingly enough, some legal drugs, some prescription drugs, are now being used for non-legal purposes to gain enhancement. So students in law school or medicine school in the United States are using Ritalin, a drug that is used to treat attention deficit disorder, in order to increase their attention when they're studying for finals. And they're good at them. What will happen the day they start to drive the average up? Happens to those who are not using the drug, right? So here's a myth. The myth is that pharmacology, it's only about curing diseases. The truth is that pharmacology, like many other sciences, can be used for many things, including other things that curing diseases. Kind of like the plane. You don't only use it to fly the mail. People discovered that they could also jump from the plane with a parachute and have fun with it. So what this means is that cartels today are not only the masters of logistics that we know they are. Here you have 121 planes smuggling drugs from South America to Mexico to go there to the United States. You have the same trajectory from Afghanistan to Central Europe to the rest of Europe. So we know that they're very good at moving stuff. Right? That we know already. We kind of know it by intuition. They take a product from territory A to territory B. What they are also is that they are the Hollywood of pharma. Right? They are the guys who know how to have fun and how to research and develop, because if you try to create a startup to have recreational pharmaceuticals or enhancement pharmaceuticals, you probably will go to prison. So you have to be one of them in order to do it, right? So to put it in perspective, right? This is our Silicon Valley for non-medical pharmacology. These are the guys who can start tomorrow's startup to find a way to create new human experiences through the use of pharmacology. So going back to this formula, with the first and the third one that I mentioned, those are risk mitigation variables or objectives of the current regulatory environment. Those make sense. We have risk mitigation for every product that we develop. If you develop a product, you'll have to come up with ways in which it doesn't interfere with other products, it doesn't produce any kind of harm, etc. So we are good at dealing with risk mitigation to a certain point. The variable number 2, it's about how to use the product. So I want to ask a question. How would a world look like where you remove that variable, and where your policies are based on risk mitigation, but not in defining what the objective of pharmacology would be like? So let's come back to the initial question. Prohibition or legalization? Here's my answer, and this is what bothers me. Are you crazy? Meth, cocaine, heroin, solvents, that's rat poison, right? Those are products that have been researched and developed by criminal entrepreneurs with the objective of fighting the interdiction, not to make them better, not to make them safer, not to make them healthier. Their objective is to stay alive when fighting governments and military forces. Should we make laws to allow for innovation for better and safer drugs? We have the science, or we think we have, to be able to produce alcohol that wouldn't kill you, that wouldn't intoxicate you, that would give you just a nice buzz, but it doesn't matter how much you would drink, you wouldn't get intoxicated, you couldn't die from it. We know we could do it. Should we? So to the original question of legalization versus prohibition, I say none of the above. Now, I leave the question to you. What about the regulation of pharmaceutical innovation for legitimate non-medical pharma? Is it the time now to admit that biotech is exploding in places like Lithuania, where you're becoming a hub of biotechnology clusters, right? And many of the innovations that will come will have many objectives, and some of those will be for enhancement, some of those will have recreational capabilities, right? And some of those will actually be safer ways to have fun with pharma, better than alcohol and tobacco that are already illegal. So should we change our frame to think about non-medical pharma? Thank you very much.